Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Human Biology. Today, we are going to talk about those magnificent, those marvelous, those you can't live without them, bones. So, Chapter 12 is all about the skeletal system. So just as a little recap on what other things that we're going to do is that we are going to spend most of the time talking about the types of cells that are found in the bones. We're going to talk about the types of bones that you would find, and we're going to talk a little bit about some diseases or conditions of the skeletal system. So the point of this chapter is not to learn all 206 bones of the human body, but to have a good introductory understanding of the job of the skeletal system, what it does, what it's composed of, and how it does what it needs to do. And we'll have a very brief discussion on joints. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So the skeletal system consists of two different types of connective tissue. And if you'll remember back from chapter 4, bone is a structural type of connective tissue, just like cartilage was a structural type of connective tissue. So we consist of the bone and the cartilage. Now, ligaments are these fibrous connective tissues that actually joins the bones. So remember, ligaments and tendons were very similar to one another in that they were dense connective tissues. Ligaments attach bone to bone, and tendons attach muscle to bone. In chapter 13, we'll talk about specifically some tendons. So the job of the skeletal system is A, it needs to support the body. Your muscles would just be a contracting blob on the ground without your skeletal system to hold everything upright. So when the skeletal system works with the muscular system by the muscles being attached to the bones via the tendons, it can actually move the body. Another job of the skeletal system is that it actually provides protection. Your brain, a very, very important organ, is encased in your cranium, in your skull, that has tons of little bones that help to protect that very important organ. Your heart, contrary to what many people believe, is not on the left side of your body. I know in our country, in the United States of America, we say the Pledge of Allegiance, and we cover the left side of our body, but we feel our heart beating most profoundly on the left side of our body. Contrary to what many believe, your heart is actually directly behind your sternum, and your rib cage, along with your sternum, actually protects your heart as well. Your vertebrae protects your spinal cord. So there's a lot of protection that your skeletal system provides. Another job of the skeletal system is that it provides blood cells. In fact, all of your red blood cells are made through the process called erythropoiesis in the red bone marrow. So, and then you also have your other blood cells made in the skeletal system as well, in the bone marrow. And we'll talk about that at length in some upcoming chapters. And then a final job of the skeletal system is that it helps to store some very important minerals like calcium, phosphate, and even fat. Fat's found in the yellow marrow. Calcium, we're going to see, is not only important for having nice, strong, healthy bones, but calcium is also important for nervous transmission, so for your nervous system, and it's equally important for your muscular system as well. So the anatomy of a bone. If we were to look at a long bone, which if you think about the bones of your femur or the humerus bone, the bones of your upper arm, your femur is that big thigh bone you have. It consists of two major parts, a diaphysis and an epiphysis. The diaphysis is just the shaft or the long part of the bone. And if we were to cut that diaphysis open, we would be able to see that it has a cavity or a hole inside. The walls of that medullary cavity are made of what we call compact bone. On the inside of that medullary cavity, it's filled with yellow bone marrow, which stores fat, and then it's actually lined with endosteum. Now, if we go to the ends of the long bone, the knobby parts of it, if you will, they're called the epiphysis, and they're composed of spongy bone on the inside. And within those epiphyses, you have your red bone marrow, and that is the site of red blood cell formation. So here is a very cool picture of a long bone. So what we have here is that we see that at the articulating end of that long bone, we have some cartilage. This is that knobby part that I was telling you about, that epiphysis there. And just like there is this epiphysis down here on the end, on the right there, we have the shaft of the bone, all of this here. And the inside is the medullary cavity. So the epiphysis, those articulating portions of it, so when I say articulating portions, I mean these are the parts that will connect or form a joint with another bone. They're covered with hyaline cartilage, and that was one of those different cartilage types we talked about in chapter 4. And we want that cartilage to provide a protection between, so that bone doesn't directly meet bone, and it reduces the amount of friction that's there. Without that cartilage, we can have bone scratching onto bone, and it can create bone spurs. The metaphysis is really kind of just that area or that space where the diaphysis or the shaft meets the epiphysis or the knobby end of it. So the metaphysis is just that middle portion there. The epiphyseal plate is where that cartilage, it's like a region of cartilage that allows for bone growth to take place. And then covering all the bone from the epiphysis through the compact bone of the diaphysis to the other epiphysis is the periosteum, which is just a connective tissue that is continuous with the ligaments that attach bone to bone and the tendons that connect the muscle to the bone. So there are two different types of bone tissue that we'll talk about, compact and spongy bone. Compact bone is highly organized and has these tubular units that we call osteons. Osteocytes are the actual bone cells that make up the osteons, and they lie in these lacuna. We talked about those lacuna before in chapter 4. And then that osteon has a central canal in the middle where blood vessels come in, and then you have the osteocytes lining them. So here is a beautiful picture of that. So we're just going to zoom in a little bit so that we can look at that. So this is an electron micrograph picture of an osteon itself. We see the central canal, and if we were to blow up any one of these little dots here, this is the actual osteocyte trapped into the lacunae. And so to contact or communicate one osteocyte for another, they go through these cananiculi, which are just cytoplasmic extensions of the cell to allow it to contact other cells. And so we see here in just this drawing, we've got our blood vessels, and each one of these circles is considered an osteon, and each one of the little dark lines on the inside is an osteocyte. So the tiny canals called the cananiculi connect the lacunae with an osteocyte to another. Osteocytes stay in contact with one another via the cananiculi, which we talked about. And we remember bone cells don't Facebook, they don't tweet, they don't Snapchat, they don't text. So the way that they communicate with one another is through the exchange of nutrients, ions, neurotransmitters, that sort of thing. And for bone cells, those osteocytes stay in contact with one another via these cananiculi. So spongy bone has many thin plates that we call trabeculae. It kind of looks like lattice work on the inside. Spongy bone, while it is lighter than compact bone is, it's still very, very strong. And the reason for that is because those trabeculae confer a lot of strength in many different directions. Filled within the spaces of the trabeculae is the red bone marrow. And that's where all of your blood cells are produced. So whether they're red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets, they're all going to be formed in the red bone marrow. Osteocytes in the spongy bone are kind of irregularly placed throughout the trabeculae. They don't have that nice tight organization that we'd see in the osteon of the compact bone. So there's a little bit of a difference on how you would find the osteocytes between compact bone and spongy bone. So we've already talked a little bit about cartilage and how its job, the one type of cartilage, the hyaline cartilage, is that it forms over the articulating surfaces of bones, and it keeps bones from having direct contact with one another. There's more than one type of cartilage that we will find in the skeletal system. But before we talk about those other types of cartilage, let's talk about what cartilage is and what its job is. So cartilage is not as strong as bone, but the benefit of cartilage is that it's much more flexible. So there are collagen and elastic fibers that make up the matrix of it. These cells that make up the cartilage are called chondrocytes, and like osteocytes, they also lie within the lacunae. Unlike osteocytes or osteons or the skeletal system, there's really no direct nerves or blood supply that goes to the cartilage. So it has to rely on the neighboring tissues to get that blood supply and to get all those nutrients in order for them to receive nutrients via diffusion. So that's why cartilage is a little bit slower to heal. So if you've ever heard of anyone tearing their meniscus in their knee, which is just this really awesome fibrocartilage that helps to cushion your knee and protect that knee joint, you'll notice that if they don't have surgery on it, sometimes it takes a while for it to heal. And I believe Isaiah Thomas that now plays for LA, I believe. But when he was in Boston, I believe he tore the meniscus in his knee, and he opted not to have the surgery, but to allow it to heal. And as a result of that, he didn't play for the very first half of the season when he was with because he got traded from Boston to Cleveland, when he was with the Cleveland Cavaliers. So that's just a really good example. I think it was his meniscus. That cartilage takes a while to heal. So there are 3 different types of cartilage. Hyaline we talked about. There's fibrocartilage, which we just talked about because that's the type of cartilage that's in your knee that makes up the meniscus of your knee and also into your intervertebral disc. And you have elastic cartilage as well. So the places that you'd find these different cartilage: hyaline cartilage at the ends of long bones, your nose, the ends of ribs, and your larynx and your trachea; fibrocartilage in your knee, and also the disc in between your vertebrae; and then elastic cartilage we'd find in your ear flaps, and we also find that in your epiglottis. So now we're going to talk about the 2 different types of skeletal systems that make up your body. You are made up of the appendicular skeletal system and the axial skeleton system. The appendicular skeletal system consists of all of those bones that make up your limbs, including your arms and your legs. Your axial skeleton consists of everything else, basically. So your skull, your sternum, your vertebral column, those are all part of your axial skeleton. And it's really the midline of the body. And as you can see, this is all the middle of your body. So some very important bones that we find in your axial skeleton is the group of bones that houses your brain. Now, a lot of people think your skull is just one great big giant hard bone, and that would be incorrect. There are actually several fused bones that are found that make up your skull. The biggest of those bones are the frontal bones, the parietal bone, and notice that we're only looking at the skull from just one side. So what you see for the parietal bone, there's another parietal bone on the other side. So it's actually 2 parietal bones, and you have your occipital bone in the back. You have your temporal bone here, and then you also have the zygomatic bone that you find. You have your mandible, you have your maxilla. Your maxilla, like your parietal bone, there are 2 of them, 1 on each side. The same way with your temporal bone, there are 2 of those on each side. You have these little tiny bones that make up the front of your face with the lacrimal bone, your ethmoid bone that's in there. You have nasal bones, 2 of those nasal bones on there. And each one of these bones has its own little unique little processes and foramen and places where blood vessels and nerve supply will travel through them. So here is that maxilla. So now we've taken our skull and turned it upside down, and then we have that zygomatic bone. So we have the zygomatic process of the maxilla, of the temporal bone, and then we have a zygomatic bone that's there. We have our palatine bone that's found there, and then we have our vomer bone, and then this giant hole at the base of the occipital bone is called the foramen magnum. That is where the spinal cord goes through to directly connect with your brain. You also have various sinuses that help to make your skull lighter. It helps to resonate sound, and it also helps to allow for your nasal passages to be properly moisturized. So your first sinus would be here in your frontal bone, and that's called your maxillary sinus. And then you have your frontal sinus, and then you have your maxillary sinuses that are right here. And then you have in your sphenoid bone, which we can't see this unless we explode the skull. Your sphenoid bone also has its own sphenoid sinus in there as well. So the only bone in your body that's not directly attached to other bones in your body would be your hyoid bone, which is just right there at the top of your larynx. So it's the only bone that's not directly attached to any other bone in your body. So continuing on with the axial skeleton, we have your vertebrae, and it consists of 33, your vertebral column, which consists of 33 vertebrae. There are 4 curves that provide more strength for an upright posture than a straight column. So because we have that curving that happens, that gives us more strength to our vertebral column, which means that we can sit up, stand up, run, walk for longer periods of the day than if it had been completely rigid and straight. So there are natural curves to the spine. If your spine were completely straight, you're going to have a whole lot of other issues, some of them being pinched nerves and degeneration of disc. So some diseases that we could find with the vertebral column is that we can have scoliosis. So that's an abnormal sideways curve of the spine. So instead of having that sort of lateral and posterior curve of the spine, we're having this sideways curve of it. Kyphosis is kind of a hunchback. So if you think about rounding your shoulders over and you have kind of this extra curvature going backward, that's what we call kyphosis. Lordus is an abnormal front curvature. So posterior means back and anterior means front. So it's kind of this sway back. So imagine now, instead of hunching your shoulders back or forward, you kind of put your shoulders all the way back and you think about walking that way. So people that have a lot of excess abdominal weight sometimes have that lordus of the spine, and they kind of have this sway when they walk a little bit. So none of these conditions are what we would like to see for a nice, healthy working vertebral column. The cool thing is that for many things, especially lordus, doing simple things like diet and exercise can alleviate that type of curvature, and also maintaining proper posture. Now, for different types of scoliosis, it does require maybe fixing posture alone will not be sufficient to deal with that. So you may have to have surgical procedures. So here is your vertebral column with those 33 vertebrae, and the last few here down here at the sacrum are fused. So let's go ahead and highlight this sucker. So the first 7 vertebrae make up your cervical spine. Then you have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and then we have 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then down here at the sacrum, 5 fused vertebrae in the adult sacrum, and then you have the coccyx, which is just these 4 fused vertebrae that make up the tailbone. So here we have some of the parts of the actual vertebrae itself. So remember, those vertebrae are individual bones, except for those fused bones that we talked about just a second ago. So we have the body of the vertebrae. We have the body of the vertebrae here. And then we have these facets where the ribs will actually attach to them. Then we have the vertebral canal, which is where your spinal cord will go through. And then you see these little foramen on the side. You can barely see them, those little holes in the side. That's where the nerves would come out. So you can easily see how if any one of these discs were to become slipped or herniated or otherwise damaged, that it could cause this body or any of these facets to crash down on those nerves, which would cause a lot of pain. And then the back of the vertebrae, we have the sphenous process. So those intervertebral discs that act as cushions between the vertebrae are composed of fibrocartilage, and they keep the vertebrae from grinding one another. They also act as really cool shock absorbers. So when we're running, jumping, or even walking, we don't have to worry about those bones crashing into one another. Because they are actually cartilage, that gives a lot of flexibility to the vertebral column, and we're able to bend, move forward and backward, and move from side to side. Now, sometimes those discs can become weakened with age, or there can be damage that's done to them, and they can actually herniate or bulge out and rupture. If that happens, then that disc presses against the spinal cord or the nerves, and it can be quite painful. People that have degenerative disc disease, they have their intervertebral disc are actually degenerating and disintegrating with time, and as a result, they have bone spurs because the bone of the vertebral columns are grinding against one another, and those bone spurs can actually push against those nerves. So on to the front part. So this would be the anterior aspect of the axial skeleton. We were just in the posterior aspect of the axial skeleton with the vertebral column. Now in the front, in the anterior, we have our thoracic vertebrae that make up the back portion of it. And then we have our ribs. So we have our true ribs here. There are 7 true ribs. And then you have your floating ribs down here at the bottom. They connect to the vertebrae. Remember, we talked about those articulating facets on the vertebrae in the back there. And then they also have this cartilage, this hyoid cartilage that connects the vertebrae to the sternum, which is composed of the body, the xiphoid process, and the mandibrium. So now we're going to go to the appendicular skeleton. So this would be all of the bones of the arms and of the legs. So we have 2 different girdles that we're going to talk about. We'll talk about the pelvic girdle, which attaches the legs, and then we have the pectoral girdle, which attaches the arms. So that consists of the scapula, which is your shoulder blade, and then your collarbone. So if you think about it in the back would be the scapula, and the front, or the anterior portion, is your clavicle bone. So in that shoulder joint, you've got a lot of stuff that's going on there. So if we were to look at your scapula, we'd see that we have an acromion process on the scapula. That acromion process then will connect to the sternum, the clavicle connects the scapula to the sternum. So the clavicle joins with the sternum and the acromion process of the scapula there. So if you take your hands and you put them right there to that bone on your clavicle, and then for my body, if I put my thumb on my clavicle bone, and then I can reach over and kind of feel my acromion process, all of that is my clavicle there. The muscles of the arm and the chest are connected to the coracoid of the scapula, so it's kind of a bone part of the scapula. The glenoid cavity is where the scapula articulates with the humerus. So that all sounds really complicated. It just looks better if we look at a picture. We should have just done this from the beginning, right? So here's that clavicle that's attached to that acromion process. There are multiple ligaments that are in there that keep all that together. Then you have, so this bone here is the scapula. This one is the clavicle, and this guy over here is the humerus. So we have this scapular bone, and then that glenoid process, or glenoid cavity, is where the humerus attaches to the scapula. So the shoulder joint, or that rotator cuff area, is very mobile, but it's also really unstable. And that's the thing about joints. The more movable or mobile a joint is, the less strength that it has, which means that it can dislocate very easily. The more strength a joint has, the less mobile it is. So remember all those bones that we had of the skull? There are joints in between those bones as well, but they're almost dang near fused together. They're very tightly packed together. So they don't have a lot of flexibility, but they're also very, very strong. So it's kind of a give and take relationship between strength and mobility. Ligaments and tendons help to stabilize this very mobile joint. Rotator cuff are the tendons that extend from the humerus, from 4 muscle groups that attach to the scapula, and we'll talk about those in chapter 13. If you do vigorous circle movement arm, it can actually lead to rotator cuff injury. So if you think about people that are pitchers, people that pitch that have lots and lots of circular motions there, they routinely will have rotator cuff tears or injuries because of that repetitive movement. So now going down to the pelvic girdle, we have our pelvis down there. What we will find, that there are 3 portions of the pelvis. The top part is called the ilium, and then you have the pubis, and then the bottom part down here is the ischium. The big femur bone attaches to the acetabulum of the pelvis bone there, and then we can go down even further, and we see this other very flexible joint of the knee, and just like the shoulder, highly movable, highly flexible joint, but it also is not as strong as some other joints because of that mobility. But like the shoulder, we have tendons and ligaments to help protect and stabilize that area. So anytime we talk about articulations, which we've been talking about how when bones come in contact with other bones, there's hyaline cartilage at that articulating surface there. It just means our bones come together. So the 3 different types of classification that we can give for an articulation is that it can be fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial. Most fibrous joints are immovable. So let's think about those bones and the joints that are formed between those cranial bones and the skull. We call those sutures. They're immovable. They don't really move a whole lot, except for when you're like a toddler and a new baby that your soft spot still hasn't filled in yet. Those are very, very strong joints. They just don't have a whole lot of flexibility. Cartilaginous joints are joints that are connected by hyaline cartilage, so the costal cartilages that we found in the rib, or the fibrocartilages that we find in the intervertebral disc. And they're like, we would consider an amphibious joint because it's a slightly movable. So there is some movement there. So it's not as rigid and strict as a fibrous joint, but it's not as loose as a synovial joint. Synovial joints are freely moving. So these are just very loose diarthrotic joints that they can move in many, many different directions. So Talking about synovial joints, for all synovial joints, they're going to have ligaments set to help to support and strengthen the joint because remember, it doesn't have a lot of strength to it because it is so flexible. They all have these joint capsules that surround the joint. There's going to be a synovial membrane that lines that capsule to secrete this fluid that we need for lubrication. We have these bursae or fluid-filled sacs that also, along with the synovial membrane and synovial fluid, help to reduce friction so that you don't have bone-on-bone movement. And if we're talking in the knee in particular, and even in the shoulder, you have menisci, which are these fibrocartilage that helps to act as shock absorbers, and they also provide some stability for the joint itself. So now that we've talked about the types of bones in the skeletal system, we talked about the job of the skeletal system, we talked about the types of joints we see in the skeletal system, how those bones fuse together, what a long bone looks like, what spongy bone looks like, what compact bone looks like. Now we're going to talk about exactly how the bone grows, how it reshapes itself, and how it repairs. Your skeletal system it's constantly replacing itself, and I think it was estimated that you get like 4 or 5 new skeletons if you were to take all the remodeling that's happened throughout your skeletal system, from the time you're born to the time you die. You get like 4 or 5 brand new skeletal systems throughout your lifetime. So you're constantly regenerating itself. And the reason it can do that is because it has these very different types of bone cells. So far, we've only really talked about one type of bone cell, and those are the osteocytes. Those are the mature bone cells. Osteoblasts are those cells that we call bone forming cells or bone building cells. B for blast, B for building. So the way that they do that is that they secrete this organic matrix of bone, and they promote or actually call for calcium salts to be deposited in that matrix. So osteoblasts become mature bone cells or osteocytes. So once that osteoblast is completely surrounded by these deposit take calcium salts, the osteocytes become trapped in the lacunae and it becomes a full-blown it's a mature bone cell. Osteoclasts are what we consider bone absorbing cells, or a neat way to remember this is classed C, crashing C. So they're the bone crashing cells. They break down the bone and they return calcium phosphate to the blood. So the question you're probably asking yourself is, why on earth would I ever want to have calcium out of my bone and put into your bloodstream? Well, remember, calcium and phosphate is not only needed for the skeletal system, but we also need it for muscle contractions, and synaptic transmissions. So throughout your life, osteoclasts remove bone matrix and osteoblasts will build them up. And it's this constant cycle that happens literally until the day you die. So the fancy name that we give this formation of new bone is called ossification. So bones form during embryonic development in 2 ways, either via intramembranous ossification or endochondral ossification. With intramembranous ossification, that forms the flat bone. So that means all those bones of the skull that we looked at, they're going to form via intramembranous ossification. So the way that process works is that between sheets of fibrous connective tissue, the osteoblasts in the periosteum the bones between the sheets of fibrous connective tissue will actually start to bring all the good nutrients and bone building cells or osteoblasts to that cell. And then as those osteoblasts are trapped in that area, they will actually continue to carry out that ossification. The trabeculae will form and fuse in the compact bone, and the spongy bone is going to be surrounded from that compact bone on the outside. Now, endochondral ossification, this is going to form most of your long bones. So that is bones like your femur, your humerus, your tibia, your fibula. All of those bones formed by endochondral ossification. So there are approximately about 5 steps to endochondral ossification. And the process, for the most part, begins with the bone matrix replacing the hyaline cartilage models of the bones. And that bone formation spreads from the center, so it starts in the center until it gets to the epiphysis. So here we have the cartilaginous model that begins to develop during fetal development. So this is the model of the bone itself. And then what we have happening here is that osteoblasts that are delivered via blood vessels will start to form this compact bone on the outside, and then you have these chondrocytes will start to kind of grow and get larger and then die, and they release chemicals to call for more of these bone building cells to come to the area. So blood vessels will bring more osteoblasts into the area, and at this center point we call this a primary ossification center. So remember that this whole process of building bone from this cartilage model begins in the middle of the bone itself. The medullary cavity starts to be hollowed out, and we get this bone color that thickens, and then you have these secondary ossification centers start to appear in the epiphysis of the bone. So throughout your childhood, growth is still happening as long as there's cartilage at these growth plates. And what you'll find is that as the child gets older, this amount of cartilage starts to shrink because it starts to become bone, and the bone begins to get longer and longer and longer until there's no more cartilage left. It's left for the epiphysis line, and that means that's how we know we stopped growing. So that's why when you look at X-ray, you can tell if a child has stopped growing or not. So this epiphyseal growth plate, which you're probably familiar with that term, it has different zones to it. So we have this end here is the epiphysis. This is the resting zone where the cells aren't really doing a whole lot of anything. At the proliferating zone, this is where we have the proliferation of that cartilage there to make more of this growth plate. And then we have the degenerating zone where it starts to be broken down. And then this is where bone has replaced that cartilage. So to help with the bone growth, not only do we have these osteoblasts that build, but we also have vitamin D that helps to helps the body absorb more calcium. So vitamin D is formed when the skin is exposed to sunlight, or you can get it as a supplement from stores, but your body makes vitamin D. So the name that it's given a vitamin is kind of a misnomer, because anything that's a vitamin usually implies that you can't get it from outside your body, that you can't make it inside your body. You have to get it from outside of it. But with vitamin D, you actually can make it. So vitamin D is converted to a hormone called cholecalciferol that helps your body to absorb calcium from the food. If you don't have very good vitamin D levels, then you're not going to have a lot of calcium deposited into your bones, and your bones will start to bow out, and what we call the rickets. So it's a bone deformity where the long bones are going to be bowed out, very exaggerated quite profoundly. So if you just kind of Google rickets, you'll be able to see a picture of what that looks like. Other things that help to affect bone growth are growth hormone that actually stimulates bone growth. You need concurrent actions of the thyroid hormone to stimulate metabolism. In dwarfism, we have too little growth hormone in childhood, and in giantism, we have excess growth hormone in childhood. Growth hormone is released from a pituitary gland that's kind of attached to the base of your brain there. Acromegaly is excess growth hormones in adults, and you have excessive growth of bones in the hands and also in the face. Sex hormones increase growth during adolescence, which is why you will see teenagers, one summer they might, in 8th grade year, they might seem really short, and then like over the summer they've grown like 3 inches, and that's particularly true for males. So bone remodeling happens when osteoclasts break down bone and osteoblasts build it up again. And this process of remodeling recycles about 18% of your bone every year. Paget's disease is new bone is generated much faster than a normal rate. So we have lots and lots of new bone that's happening here. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, that should probably be a good thing. But what it does is that it produces softer and weaker bones, and it can cause a lot of bone pain, or what they consider, they probably heard about growth pain. When kids are going through a growth spurt, they have just some growing pains and aches in their bones and their joints. But it can also cause a lot of that pronounced bone pain, deformities, and because the bones are weaker, it can also lead to fractures. So we talked about how important calcium is. It must have to be maintained at a certain level, and that's absolutely true. You need a certain amount of calcium in your bloodstream at all times. So in order to maintain this level, we have parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone, its job is to, and please put a pin in this, it's very important, you will see this again, is that it stimulates osteoclast activity. So the osteoclast will actually dissolve or break down the bone. When it does that, that puts more calcium into the bloodstream. So the blood calcium levels will be increased when parathyroid hormone is released, because part one, it's breaking down the bone and releasing that calcium into the bloodstream. It also, parathyroid hormone, helps the body to absorb more calcium in the small intestine and in the kidneys. Vitamin D is needed for the absorption of calcium from the digestive tract. And remember, how do we make vitamin D? Do we have to get it in a supplement? Do we have to get it in food? Nope, just being outside in sunlight helps your body to make this. So on the opposite of parathyroid hormone, we have calcitonin. Calcitonin has the opposite effect. So that is going to take calcium out of the bloodstream and put it in the skeletal system. Estrogen increases the number of osteoblasts. So as a result, if more osteoblasts are released, then we have more uh, bone building activity, so we're going to have more bone building made. But as you get older, especially if as an older woman going through menopause, it reduces the number of estrogen, and that can lead to osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is a condition where the bones are weakened due to a decreased bone mass. Skeletal mass increases until about age 30. After that, there's an equal rate of formation and breakdown, so it's kind of you're pretty much stable until about 50. Then you're going to have more reabsorption begin to take place, and the total bone mass will slowly start to increase. Now, risk factors on whether you will develop osteoporosis or not is that for the most part, it affects primarily women, but there are some men that are affected, but mostly women. And white Asian women are more affected than other demographics or other races, and then people that are thin or have a family history of osteoporosis, folks that have early menopause onset, smoking, a diet low in calcium, too much caffeine or alcohol, caffeine includes coffee, and just having a sedentary lifestyle can also lead to osteoporosis. So even if you are one of those risk factors, for developing osteoporosis, by doing weight-bearing exercises are excellent for women, especially after age 30, because it helps your bones actually will maintain their bone mass and actually start to build more bone mass. That's helpful. Having a nice diet where you reduce the amount of caffeine and alcohol that you consume, and making sure, and smoking, I can't think of anything that smoking is good for, to be quite honest with you. But having a diet that's rich in calcium and eating lots of leafy green things, even if you do have a high risk factor for developing osteoporosis, there are things that you can do now that will prevent that in the future. So the final thing that we'll talk about is how your body repairs itself in reference to a bone fracture. So the first thing that happens is that when you break a bone, it bleeds. So it forms this hematoma. So that little blood pooling around is what happens there. So because we have that blood pooling there, then your body is going to call for all these healing things to come to the area, healing cells to come to that area. So then we have a cartilaginous callus that's made. That cartilaginous callus through endochondral or through endochondral ossification, yes, through ossification, it's going to turn that cartilaginous callus into a bony callus, and then we have that healed fracture. So to be honest with you, your body actually completely heals its own fracture. The reason you go to a doctor and to see an orthopedic specialist when you break a bone is to help set it and make sure that that bone heals straight and doesn't heal curved or crooked. So the types of bone fractures we have are complete fractures where the bone is broken clear through from one side to the next. Incomplete fracture means that the bone is not separated into two distinct parts, so it's only cracked on one side. A simple fracture means that it did not pierce the skin. A compound fracture means that the situation just got worse, and the bone, even if it's a complete or incomplete fracture, pierces through the skin. Impacted fractures, the broken bones are wedged into each other, so instead of them being cleanly broken apart from one another, they're kind of jammed on top of one another. And a spiral fracture is a break that is due to twisting of the bone. So my son, when he was 13, had a spiral fracture. He was playing basketball in the driveway, and he fell down on his hand, and then another kid fell on top of him. And because he fell on his hand to try to brace himself, one of the bones, the metacarpal bones in his hand, was broken on the top part of that metacarpal, and then it spiraled around to the bottom of that bone. And it kind of, because he was kind of a twisting motion that he had with that. All right, so that is all of chapter 12. Chapter 13, we're going to talk about the muscles and how they are connected with the skeletal system, as well as what does calcium do for muscles. So we're still going to talk about calcium again. Have a great morning, afternoon, or night.